For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hi, welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. I'm the purveyor of this podcast, and today we're going to be talking about Revelation 4, verse 4. And if you want to get the nutshell version of this podcast in a written form, you can check out section 41 of my book that covers, in essence, what we'll be talking about for the next, half hour, 45 minutes. I guess it depends on how many stories I tell. At any rate, last time we talked about Revelation 4:3, and just to give a little context for what we'll be talking about today, in that last podcast we discussed how John had an open door in this view of paradise in heaven, where he saw a throne and God the Father seated on the throne. His glory was described as a jasper and sardine stone, representing his eternal nature, among other things. And all around the throne you had this emerald rainbow in a horizontal plane as a symbol of life and mercy. So that's where we find ourselves as we begin now in Revelation 4 and see what else is going on around this throne on the emerald rainbow. So in Revelation 4:4 it says, quote, "And round about the throne there were 24 seats, and upon the seats I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold." Close quote. So since this is the only verse we're going to be covering today, that's what we have to look forward to, is the meaning of all these various symbols, beginning first with the 24 seats. Now, the word seats in the original Greek comes from the word thronoi or thronos, which actually means throne. So this would have been better translated if rather than seats it actually said thrones. So it is a seat, but it's really a seat on which a monarch would sit. And the same word appears 53 times in the New Testament. And of those 53 times that this word in the Greek appears, 48 of those times it's translated as the word throne, leaving 5 occasions on which it's translated as the word seat or seats, and 4 of those 5 are found in the book of Revelation. And as I mentioned, realistically, they should have all been translated as the word thrones, because here we're looking at these seats of 24 elders that have this white raiment. They have crowns on their head. And so what are they if they're not kings who are sitting on thrones? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But essentially you have these 24 thrones that are surrounding the great throne of God, who has on it the Father in paradise. And so the other thing that we're talking about here with regard to these thrones is that it talks about how they are round about the throne. So in other words, they encircle the throne, and this roundabout comes from the Greek word kylo, which means surrounding. So this tends to confirm what we talked about last time when I said that this emerald rainbow is circular rather than a half circle that we're kind of used to seeing when we see a rainbow in the sky, and also that probably this rainbow would have to be said that it's in a horizontal plane. Otherwise, if John were looking at the image of the throne of God in a circle that is an emerald rainbow and it's vertical, then the throne is basically kind of sitting on its side. And so unless you're watching the movie Inception, which has all these kind of funky images while people are in the dream state, it makes more sense that John is looking at the throne of God in this horizontal plane. So let's focus now on these 24 seats, or the thrones, in verse 4, and the 24 elders that we see seated upon these thrones. Now, first of all, with regard to the word elders, this comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which could be any kind of a prominent political or religious leader. Essentially, it represents some type of authority in either of those realms. So, for example, among the Romans, you might consider a presbytero to be a senator. Among the Jews, it would be a member of the Sanhedrin, and oftentimes they were called the elders. Among the Christians, it would have been a person who was the local clergyman, a bishop, or other leader among that group. And then in the Old Testament, if you go back a ways, this word would be used to describe men of wisdom, experience, and maturity. And so in this regard, we think about the 70 elders that Moses called to help judge the people. They were present with him on Mount Sinai and other things like that. So we kind of take all of those historical meanings and we try and understand then what is being referred to when we talk about the elders with reference to these 4 and 20 seats. And so first thing we want to do is distinguish the 24 elders. Now these guys are going to come up fairly frequently, probably as much as a dozen times in the book of Revelation. And so it's kind of important that we figure out who they are here at the start. And to do that, the first thing that we want to do is kind of distinguish between these 24 elders from other images of persons and things that John is seeing in this vision of paradise in Revelation 4, and then continuing with the same vision in Revelation chapter 5. So first of all, the 24 elders are going to be distinct from the 4 beasts that John sees surrounding the throne in Revelation 4:6. So we will get to these beasts in due course, but it's important to understand because of their distinction in the same vision, they have different meanings. And so they kind of do things together. They're in close proximity with each other. They're all part of the same vision, but the things that they do, their actions, their status, and their condition, and also their proximity to the throne, all differ in one regard or another. And so we want to make sure that we keep them distinguished one from another. Also, we have to draw a distinction between the 24 elders from the 100 plus million angels that John is eventually going to see in Revelation 5:11. So we begin here with the throne of God in what would have to be this kind of concentric circle. And then we get these 24 elders seated on their 24 thrones. We have 4 beasts surrounding the throne. And eventually this thing is going to expand out. And we're going to get this 100 plus million angels that John sees later on during his revelation. And all of these things we have to keep distinguished. And just kind of as a scenes to coming attractions, you have to recognize that these 100 plus million angels are all going to be disembodied spirits in the same post-mortal spirit world. But John eventually has his vision expanding from paradise. And as you go out from paradise, you're going to see these other 100 plus million angels who are actually part of spirit prison. All right. And so he's going to see the entirety of the post-mortal spirit world as it exists roughly in 96 AD, or the time of his vision, but it's this kind of ever-expanding circle that he's going to see. So we'll talk about them some more when we get to that point in our discussion, but all of these things have to be kept separate. And the reason for keeping them separate, of course, is John sees the 24 elders seated on thrones, which distinguishes them in large measure from this other 100 plus million angels that he sees that don't have thrones. They're not close to the throne. And as we kind of keep all of these things in mind, we have a better appreciation and understanding of what the vision is that we're talking about. So some have suggested that these 24 elders represent the church leaders. Again, keeping in mind the word elder and presbyteros, the Greek word, it seems logical that there would be some connection to the church leaders, and there is, but it's not the living elders of the church in 96 AD. John was seeing things which must shortly come to pass. And so if you kind of compare this with some of the visions that Joseph Smith had, for example, in 1836, in the 137th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph had a vision where he saw his mother and father, who were still living, but saw them in a future condition in the celestial kingdom. So you can have these kinds of visions, but we're told specifically who these 24 elders are in Doctrine and Covenants section 77.5, and it's not the living leaders of the church. So this section defines these elders as follows, saying, quote, "What are we to understand by the 24 elders spoken of by John? We are to understand that these elders whom John saw were elders who had been faithful in the work of the ministry and were dead, who belonged to the 7 churches and were then in the paradise of God." Close quote. So this scriptural declaration as to the meaning of the 24 elders makes it clear that, yes, we're talking about the leaders of the church and the leaders of the 7 churches in particular. Now, in case you've already forgotten everything we've already talked about, these 7 churches, see, they kind of keep coming up. So they become important in the context of understanding John's future vision. So you can always go back and listen to my podcast. They're not going anywhere. But these 7 churches are those that were in Asia Minor. And these elders, these 24, are representative of the leaders of those 7 churches who are dead and are in the paradise. Again, this is confirming that the vision John is having here in Revelation chapter 4 is a vision of disembodied spirits in the post-mortal spirit world. They are spirits of the just who qualified for themselves to be in paradise at the time of their death. If they had not qualified for that, they would be in the spirit prison, which we'll talk about in due course. So these 24 elders essentially are specific men. They are individuals, but they are individuals who represent a larger category. And so as we view them, as we see them later on in other parts of John's vision, we're going to see them actually talking to John. So it's an individual, like an individual angel. One of them will speak to John in later visions. If you go into Revelation chapter 5, you're going to see all 24 of them singing what is called a new song in order to honor and glorify God the Father and his Son Jesus Christ. Now, what's kind of interesting about the 24 is that they have these thrones, and of course they're sitting, or they're in a seated position, kicking back, maybe eating popcorn, so I don't know. But at any rate, the fact that they are sitting denotes their state of rest in the post-mortal spirit world. They are settled, and they are in a secure state of happiness. And that's something that implies the conditions in the paradise of God as disembodied spirits. This is a place where, of course, Satan has no presence. He has no influence in paradise, so they are essentially at rest. They have passed the trials and rigors of mortality. They have succeeded. They've been victorious, and therefore they qualify themselves to be in paradise. And that means they essentially have lived celestial law. Now, keep in mind, I'm not trying to distinguish right now per se between spirits that enter paradise by living celestial law and those that enter paradise living celestial law, and also the laws that qualify themselves for exaltation. When we're talking about the 24 saints or elders, these obviously qualify for exaltation. That's why they have thrones. That's why they have white raiment. That's why they have crowns. It's because they will exist in an exalted condition. But that's not to say that there aren't other angels in paradise who enjoy the same type of rest and peace and security outside the presence of Satan. Now, Bruce R. McConkie had this to say by way of describing the paradise that we're talking about here that John is seeing in Revelation chapter 4. And Elder McConkie said, quote, "Paradise, the abode of righteous spirits as they await the day of their resurrection. Paradise, a place of peace and rest, where the sorrows and trials of this life have been shuffled off, where the saints continue to prepare for a celestial heaven. Paradise, not the Lord's eternal kingdom, but a way station along the course leading to eternal life, a place where the final preparation is made for that fullness of joy which comes only when the body and spirit are inseparably connected with immortal glory." Close quote. So that's a really great quote that describes for us the nature of the conditions in paradise and expresses why these 24 elders who are exaltation worthy are seated on thrones, and they're at a place where they can be at peace and rest. And note also, Elder McConkie makes it very clear that in paradise, these individuals are still awaiting a celestial resurrection to exaltation. And for these individuals, given the fact that we're now in 96 AD, these individuals will be awaiting their resurrection to exaltation, which will occur at the time of Christ's second coming. So we know that when Christ was crucified and he was resurrected, this began the morning of the first resurrection. And all those exaltation-worthy saints who had lived prior to the resurrection of Jesus Christ rose with him in his resurrection in the meridian of time. And so that would be the Abrahams, the Isaacs, the Jacobs, essentially anyone in the Old Testament times who qualified for exaltation, both because they lived worthy lives and because they entered into the covenants, the ordinances of the gospel that would qualify them to come into the celestial kingdom and to be exalted. In short, we're talking about they had baptism. They had the sealing ordinance. Those were prerequisites for them being able to be resurrected at the time of Christ. So all of them get resurrected together with Christ, but now in 96 AD, essentially, as saints die who are exaltation worthy, their disembodied spirits then go into paradise, where the next time the first resurrection resumes, because it is not continuous, between the time of the Savior's resurrection and the time of his second coming, there's this kind of hiatus or a pause for almost 2,000 years, kind of a long pause. But for 2,000 years, essentially we have people whose disembodied spirits are entering paradise, and they will be resurrected at the time of the second coming, just immediately precedent to the second coming, because as you think about it, these are people who will rise up from the graves to meet the Savior in the air and then descend with him. So timing-wise, they resurrect immediately before the time of the second coming. And also those saints who are living, who are translated, transfigured. We'll get into what those terms mean and the difference between them. Also rise up, then descend with him at the time of his second coming. So all of these participate in the mourning of the first resurrected as exalted saints. They all will have crowns. They all will have thrones. And these 24 elders are representative of this group of people. And again, I'm going to beat this dead horse just a little bit more in talking about the 3 degrees of glory that exist in the celestial kingdom, because in order to obtain the highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom, you have to have the sealing ordinance. And this is made clear in Doctrine and Covenants, section 131, verses 1 through 4, which states, quote, "In the celestial glory there are 3 heavens or degrees, and in order to obtain the highest, a man must enter into this order of the priesthood, meaning the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And if he does not, he cannot obtain it. He may enter into the other, but that is the end of his kingdom. He cannot have an increase." Close quote. And I beat on this horse because as Latter-day Saints, those who have an understanding of these things, you have to understand, we're not just shooting for the celestial kingdom. I'm sure it's going to be great for anybody and everybody who makes it there, but if you fail to reach that highest degree of glory in the celestial kingdom, you're cutting yourself short, all right? And so that must ultimately and always be our goal. And so that's what these 24 elders represent, and they are represented as all those exaltation-worthy saints in paradise as of the time of John's vision in 96 AD, and those who will also come into the paradise at some point in time. And so, as I have talked about in prior podcasts, as we've been talking about paradise is really a dynamic place. It's not static. It's not like we can look at it at one point in time and it's always going to be the same thing. And so the thing that, and the mistake that some people make is interpreting what John is saying as members of the church in general. and even members of the celestial kingdom generally. But because there are these three tiers, we have to recognize that John is only talking about those in the very highest tier. So I'll give you an example, and it's interesting because I'm going to quote what J.A. Seiss has to say. Now he's a guy that wrote a book called The Apocalypse, Lectures on the Book of Revelation, that was published in about 1972. So he's not a Latter-day Saint, but he's someone who talks about who these guys are, that these 24 elders that we see here in paradise. And he said, quote, "They are partakers of celestial dominion. They are kings of glory with golden crowns. They are settled and at home in their exalted dignities, not standing and waiting as servants, but seated as royal counselors of the Almighty. They are the elders of the glorious house of the redeemed, and kings and priests in the temple and palace of the Lord God Almighty, whom all the earth shall obey and all ages acknowledge." Close quote. Now that guy could be a member of the church with a complete understanding of what John is saying, because he even uses a lot of terms that are familiar to us, such as the celestial dominion and kings and queens and all of these things that we understand and appreciate. So he's a guy that's really honed in on this in terms of describing these 24 elders in their representative capacity of all exaltation-worthy saints in the Church of Jesus Christ from any age or era of the world. And so what John is saying essentially, as I've mentioned before, is this kind of a snapshot of those exaltation-worthy people represented by the 24 elders as of 96 AD, and those who die thereafter until we get to the second coming. And by that time, it's going to be a much larger group. If it's not, then we're doing something wrong, because we exist in this time and in this age to help others to become qualified to be exaltation worthy through the vicarious ordinances that we perform in the temple. And all of those spirits you got up there in the post-mortal spirit world just hanging out for somebody here on earth to do their work. But as soon as it happens, they then become qualified. Spirits in spirit prison who don't have the ordinances can't cross the bridge and go into paradise until those ordinances are done. And so they're all hanging, waiting for us. And what happens is John, as we roll along, once we get to Revelation chapter 7, in about 3 chapters hence, he's going to see another vision of paradise that's moved forward in time, and he's now seeing the paradise as it exists in these latter days, and time as the approach of the second coming is getting near. And this is what he says about what he then sees in paradise, and you're going to see a big difference. In Revelation 7:9, he says, quote, "After this I beheld, and lo, a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, stood before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes and palms in their hands." Close quote. So in Revelation 4, John is seeing this vision of paradise, these disembodied spirits who are exaltation worthy, and he doesn't give us a specific sense of how many there are. He just says these 24 elders are representative of this large group of exaltation worthy saints. But then you go 3 chapters later, he's seeing the same scene, and all of a sudden it's like this big surprise. And behold, wow, there's a lot of people here. And he calls them this great multitude, which no man could number, and of every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. World number 4 encompassed in that description of what John is seeing here in the celestial paradise. They're all before the throne, and so you can see how this is a changing, dynamic, and growing place of disembodied spirits in paradise, which will continue to grow until the time of the second coming. And at that point in time, guess what? All those people get resurrected, and we empty out paradise. We don't have all disembodied spirits anymore. And so you kind of got to understand this about what's going on. Okay, let's move on and talk a little bit about the question of why do we have 24 of these guys sitting on thrones? We know that they represent the saints of the 7 churches. The 7 churches, of course, represent the universal church. And so in some sense, it makes sense that this 24 is somehow going to be related to the universality of the church and what John is trying to describe. And so some people thinking about 24, they think, okay, if we consider the Church of Christ, and even though Christ had not been born, he was Jehovah of the Old Testament. He had his church. He was the God of the Old Testament, and he was God of the New Testament. And so they think in terms of, well, we had 12 patriarchs in the Old Testament, meaning the sons of Jacob or Israel. And then in the New Testament, we have the 12 apostles. You put those two together, voila, doing the quick math, which even a lawyer can do, we have the 12, the number of 24. Something along a similar vein, if you think about how this would be representative of universality, we could think in terms of the Eastern Hemisphere, as well as then the Western Hemisphere. So you have two 12s equaling 24. Some say that you should take the 12 tribes that get doubled to then account in the New Testament for the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, ending up with the total of 24. But in all of these kinds of descriptions and suggestions about where this number comes from, the problem is that they're looking at the whole church too broadly. Because keep in mind, I've just mentioned to you, and hopefully I beat soundly into your head, that these 24 don't represent the whole church. They represent exaltation-worthy saints. And that is a much narrower group than simply people who are in the church. People in the church can qualify for the celestial kingdom, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they qualify for exaltation. And so we can't think quite so broadly in terms of what the meaning of the 24 mean as to encompass or embrace all of the people in the church. Now, certainly it is a number that embraces and welcomes all exalted saints from all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people. So it is a worldwide numbers, but if you want to associate it with any church in particular, the church that they really ought to be associated with would be the Church of the Firstborn, which is the millennial church. And that's consistent with John's kind of forward-looking vision that is always kind of pointing toward the millennial church. So rather than looking backwards to what happened in the Old Testament, and all those guys were resurrected anyway at the time of Christ, we look forward to the millennial church and the establishment of the Church of the Firstborn, which is essentially an evolution of the ecclesiastical church that exists upon the earth today into a church that is both ecclesiastical and political in its form, but it is also limited by its numbers to those who are exaltation worthy. So unless you are exaltation worthy, that part of the inner circle of saints within the Latter-day Saint Church, then you are not going to be exaltation worthy. And so that's essentially what we're talking about. And so getting back to the number itself, okay, we kind of got all that. That's kind of foundational. So what is it then? You're killing me, right? Tell me what it is. Okay, so the 24 represents essentially the priesthood number of 12, but it's multiplied times 2. So sometimes the 12 is also called the church number. And if you go back to my podcast 5, CFM number 5, or Come Follow Me podcast number 5, which I did on October 25, 2023, I go through all of the numbers and their symbolism and stuff because, I knew this day was coming when we would be talking about this. So that lays the foundation for a discussion of a whole lot of numbers, including the number 12. And there are lots of occurrences of 12 in the scriptures. You have the 12 tribes. You have the 12 stones in the high priest's breastplate. You have the 12 loaves of showbread that were in the temple. You have the 12 patriarchs or the sons of Israel. You have the 12 apostles. You have 12 foundation stones in the celestial city that is described in Revelation 21, and also the 12 gates in the celestial city. You have the new Jerusalem that is 12,000 furlongs in size, in a big square or a cube. And so all of these 12, 12, 12, they're always coming up all over the place. And the 12 represents the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. And when we talk about the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood, we're essentially talking about the patriarchal order of the priesthood, that which requires temple ordinances. So you frequently have the idea of this connection between 12 and the temple, but also 24, because there's a historical precedence for the number 24 in Old Testament imagery. So for example, if you were to go to 1 Chronicles 23, verses 3 and 4, we learn there that there were 24,000 Levites who were called to conduct the work in the temple. And these 24,000 people or Levites were then arranged in 24 courses, having 24 priests or Levite priests, who then took turns officiating in the temple. So there were always 24 Levites represented who were to serve in the temple, and the 24 Levitical courses then become typological. They are not the fullness of the priesthood, but they are typological of temple work and temple ordinances that are always associated with the fullness of the priesthood, which again, when you talk about the fullness of the priesthood, we're talking about the patriarchal priesthood or the patriarchal order of the priesthood. You're talking about a royal priesthood. We're talking about a kingdom of priests, as they are sometimes referred to, and hence all of these 24 from this symbolism all wear their crowns. They represent kings, queens, priests, and priestesses, and they all share the throne of the Father and the Son. And this takes us back to the lukewarm Laodiceans in Revelation chapter 3, verse 21, where it said, quote, "To him that overcometh will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am set down with my Father in his throne." Close quote. So this promise to overcomers in the case of the Laodiceans, of course, was a more general promise that happened to be made to them, who were kind of the lowest of the low, and how they could overcome and achieve the highest of the high, and even sit on the throne of God as Jesus Christ himself overcame and sits down with his Father. That's the essence of the promise, and it's all tied back to this concept of these 24 representative priests, if you will, kings, priestesses, queens, who represent all of us, including those of us today, hopefully me included, who will qualify for exaltation. Okay, let's move on to another phrase in Revelation 4, verse 4, where it talks about these 24 elders being clothed in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold. So the white raiment obviously is connected with and symbolic of exaltation-worthy saints. It is an emblem or symbol of purity, holiness, sanctification, the righteousness of the saints, all of whom have their clothes made white in the blood of the Lamb of Jesus, who is Jesus Christ. And so that's the nature of the white raiment. We're going to come across this imagery of white raiment again and again as we go through the book of Revelation. The crowns of gold, not surprisingly, I've kind of alluded to it already, these are emblematic of a kingly office, and also those who are kings and priests. This is something that is alluded to in 1 Peter 2:9, where it says, quote, "But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Close quote. So again, the point is this idea of a royal priesthood is synonymous with the fullness of the Melchizedek priesthood. It is synonymous with the patriarchal order of the priesthood. You are not royalty unless you have received the exalting ordinances of the patriarchal order of the priesthood, which you receive only in the temple. But essentially, these crowns of gold are going to be a symbol of the right of exaltation-worthy people to rule as kings and queens following their resurrection. And it's kind of interesting because they become kings by the sovereign grace of God, but also it is their hereditary right as they live worthy of their birthright to become kings and priests as children of God, to be born again and to become as He is. And so it's also you tie into this the concept or the illusion of how the church represents the bride and Jesus Christ is the bridegroom. And so if you are going to become a king and a priest and a queen and a priestess, then you do so by your marriage alliance as the bride of Christ, and then you become joint heirs with Him in the kingdom of our Heavenly Father. And so finally you have this right to have these crowns and to sit on these thrones as these 24 elders are sitting by right of conquest. It is by right of your victory, of overcoming and enduring to the end. All of these things are that which qualifies you to have the type of crown that John is describing on the heads of these 24 elders. And you are essentially one of them if you have qualified yourself in the ways that I have spoken in terms of receiving the temple covenants and being true and faithful to those covenants until the end of your life, or if you happen to be one of the fortunate few and have your calling and election made sure in this life, so that you essentially have that guarantee of receiving this crown and of receiving exaltation and eternal life. It can happen in this life, but it's probably relatively rare. And so you look forward to that day when you too are one of these disembodied spirits in paradise, seated in a representative way on one of these thrones and having white raiment and a golden crown. And so that's essentially what we're talking about here in verse 4 of Revelation 4. And hopefully that's something we can all look forward to as a reward for our endurance. So in our next podcast, we're going to be covering Revelation chapter 4, verse 5, which talks about some more about this throne and these 7 lamps that exist before the throne. We'll explain what all that means. In the meantime, thanks for listening, watching, subscribing, sharing, caring, etc., etc. Thanks to Jenna for all her help on the technical end of things, and we'll see you next time.